"You will not survive him, Elisa," her father whispered, his hands trembling as he locked the iron-wrought gates of the estate behind her. "He is the cursed Alpha King. You are merely the sacrificial bride, a debt paid in blood." Elisa did not flinch. She stared through the rusted bars at the man who had traded her life for his empire. "Then I will pay it," she said, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "But do not expect me to die quietly." She turned toward the looming manor of David, a man feared in whispers, a beast bound by a shadowed curse. She was supposed to be a victim. She intended to be his equal. The walk up the winding cobblestone driveway felt less like an arrival and more like a funeral march. The midnight air was thick with the scent of wet pine and distant rain, carrying a chill that seeped straight through the thin fabric of Elisa's coat. High above, the moon was a pale sliver, offering just enough light to illuminate the sprawling Gothic architecture of the Blackwood estate. It sat atop the hill like a sleeping gargoyle, its stone facade dark and uninviting. Elisa dragged her lone suitcase behind her. The wheels clattered against the uneven stones, a jarring sound in the absolute, suffocating silence of the forest. She had expected guards. She had expected the snarling wolves of legend that supposedly patrolled the borders of David's territory. Instead, there was only the wind and the heavy, undeniable sensation of being watched. Her family had sold her. The realization was no longer a sharp, stabbing pain. It had settled into a dull, enduring ache. A corporate empire saved, a bloodline preserved, and all it cost was one daughter tossed into the maw of a cursed king. When she reached the massive oak doors, they swung open before she could even raise her hand to knock. Warm, golden light spilled out onto the damp stone, but it offered no comfort. Standing in the foyer was an elderly woman in a pristine, tailored suit. Her posture was rigidly straight, her expression entirely unreadable. "Miss Elisa," the woman said. Her voice was polite, perfectly modulated, yet entirely devoid of warmth. "I am Martha. I oversee the household. Please, step inside." "Thank you," Elisa replied, stepping over the threshold. The door closed behind her with a heavy, final thud that seemed to echo in her very bones. The interior of the manor was breathtakingly beautiful, yet hauntingly still. Dark mahogany, deep velvet drapes, and the faint smell of burning cedar filled the expansive space. There were no photographs, no personal touches. It looked less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to a forgotten era. "Your luggage will be taken to your quarters," Martha said, gesturing for Elisa to follow. "The master is expecting you in his study. He prefers not to keep his guests waiting." Elisa caught the slight hesitation before the word guests. She smoothed the front of her dress, a simple dark garment chosen by her mother to reflect solemnity. "Lead the way." They walked down a long corridor lined with towering windows that looked out into the pitch-black woods. At the end of the hall, Martha stopped before a set of heavy double doors. She did not knock. She simply opened one side and stepped back, gesturing for Elisa to enter. Elisa took a slow, deep breath, bracing herself to meet a monster. She stepped inside. The study was cavernous, lined wall to wall with ancient texts and modern ledgers. A massive fire roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. Standing by the window, with his back to her, was David. He did not turn immediately. The silence stretched, tight and brittle as a bowstring. Elisa used the moment to study him. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. There were no visible chains, no immediate signs of the horrific affliction the rumors spoke of. He just looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. "They actually sent you," David said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a strange, involuntary shiver down Elisa's spine. It wasn't a roar. It was a quiet rumble of profound disappointment. "A deal was struck," Elisa answered, keeping her chin high. "My family honors its debts." David finally turned. The breath hitched in Elisa's throat. He was strikingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features and dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead. But it was his eyes that caught her. They were a piercing, turbulent amber, the eyes of a predator, yet shadowed with an exhaustion so deep it looked physical. A faint, dark vein pulsed dangerously at his temple, the only visible hint of the volatile energy barely contained beneath his skin. "A debt," David repeated softly, walking slowly toward his heavy mahogany desk. He picked up a thick, wax-sealed envelope, the contract her father had signed. "Your father sold you to a cursed man to save his shipping company. Do not dress it up as honor, Elisa. It is a sacrifice, and I did not ask for it. I did not." Elisa held her ground, though her instincts screamed at her to step back as the air in the room suddenly grew dense. It felt hard to breathe, as if his very presence was pulling the oxygen from the room. "You did not refuse it either," she countered smoothly. David's amber eyes flashed, a brief, dangerous spark of light. He dropped the envelope onto the desk. "You are bold for someone standing in a lion's den, if I am to be eaten," Elisa said, her voice dropping to a calm, steady whisper. "I would prefer to look the lion in the eye." For a long moment, David just stared at her. The heavy, suffocating pressure in the room seemed to waver just slightly. A muscle worked in his jaw. "You will be shown to your room. Lock the door. Do not leave it until sunrise, no matter what you hear." The bedroom was vast and luxurious, draped in heavy silks of midnight blue and silver, but it felt like a gilded cage. Elisa sat on the edge of the sprawling four-poster bed, fully dressed. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked methodically, marking the agonizingly slow passage of time. It was 2 a.m. She had locked the door, just as David instructed. The heavy brass bolt was thrown, offering a flimsy illusion of safety. Outside, a torrential rain had begun to fall, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The storm seemed to mirror the heavy, oppressive energy that permeated the entire estate. Elisa stared at the flickering flames in the fireplace. She replayed their brief conversation in her mind. David had not been cruel. He had been cold, yes, and terrifying in his stillness. But there was no malice in his eyes. There was only a profound, suffocating isolation. The rumors painted him as a bloodthirsty tyrant, a werewolf whose human soul had been fractured by a dark witch's curse decades ago, leaving him a volatile beast. But beasts did not look at you with such hollow regret. Do not leave it until sunrise, no matter what you hear. The warning echoed in her ears. For hours, there had been nothing but the rain. But then, just as the clock struck the quarter hour, she heard it. It was a sound that made her blood run cold, a low, agonizing groan that vibrated through the very floorboards. It was followed by the sharp, violent sound of shattering glass, echoing from somewhere deep within the manor's eastern wing. Elisa stood up instantly. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took a step toward the door, then stopped. "Lock the door." Another sound tore through the night. It wasn't a wolf's howl, nor was it the scream of a man. It was something horrifyingly caught between the two, a raw vocalization of pure, unadulterated agony. Her father's voice whispered in the back of her mind. You are merely the sacrificial bride. If she stayed in this room, she was accepting that role. She was hiding, waiting to see if the monster would come for her. But Elisa had sworn she would not be a victim. If she was to live in this house, if she was bound to this man by paper and blood, she needed to know what she was facing. Moving with quiet resolve, Elisa crossed the room and slid the brass bolt back. It opened with a soft snick. She slipped out into the hallway. The manor was plunged into darkness, the only light provided by the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the tall windows. The air out here was different. It felt charged with a violent, static electricity. It smelled of ozone, copper, and something wild. She moved silently, her bare feet making no sound on the thick Persian runners. She followed the trail of devastation. In the grand hall, a priceless Ming vase lay in powdered ruins. A heavy mahogany side table had been cleaved entirely in half. The wood splintered as if struck by a cannonball. The sounds were coming from the end of the East Wing corridor. A set of heavy, reinforced doors stood slightly ajar. A strange, unnatural shadow seemed to bleed from the crack, curling along the floor like dark smoke. Elisa hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She pushed it open. It was a conservatory, though it looked more like a battlefield. Rare plants were uprooted, the glass ceiling above completely shattered, letting the rain pour freely into the room. In the center of the wreckage was David. He was on his knees, clutching his head. His tailored shirt was torn to shreds, revealing a back corded with unnatural, shifting muscle. Thick, black veins pulsed visibly beneath his skin, crawling up his neck and branching across his jawline like poison ivy. The air around him was distorted, rippling with a dark, violent aura. He let out another agonizing sound, his hands digging into his own shoulders as if trying to physically hold himself together. The curse was fighting him, attempting to tear away the last shreds of his humanity to let the mindless, destructive alpha take over. Elisa didn't run. She didn't scream. She watched the sheer, terrifying battle of will happening before her. This was not a monster reveling in bloodlust. This was a man fighting a war inside his own mind. Alone. A sharp crack of lightning illuminated the room. David's head snapped up. His eyes were no longer amber. They were a glowing, feral gold. The pupils were blown wide. He saw her standing in the doorway, and a deep, rumbling growl vibrated in his chest. It was a warning, a lethal one. I told you. His voice was distorted, layered with a gravelly, inhuman resonance. To lock the door. He pushed himself up to one knee. The dark aura around him spiked, crackling with hostility. Every instinct Elisa possessed screamed at her to turn and flee, to lock herself away and pray he didn't follow. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step forward into the rain-soaked room. You are in pain, Elisa said. Her voice was remarkably steady, cutting through the heavy, violent air like a clear bell. Leave, David snarled, a visceral command that forced a physical pressure against her chest. If I lose control, I will kill you. Elisa took another step. The rain soaked her dark dress, plastering it to her skin. She kept her eyes locked on his glowing, feral gaze. She didn't show fear. She showed defiance. Then look at me, she demanded quietly, stepping over a shattered pane of glass. Look at me, David. Focus on my voice. David flinched, as if the sound of his own name, spoken with such calm authority, had physically struck him. The black veins on his neck pulsed violently, fighting her intrusion. He let out a ragged, desperate breath. "Look at me," she repeated, taking a third step, crossing the invisible boundary into his immediate space. She was close enough now to feel the intense heat radiating from his body. David forced his eyes up to meet hers. For a split second, the feral gold flickered, and the tired, amber eyes of the man she had met in the study bled through. The thick, suffocating tension in the room hitched, caught off guard by a bride who refused to cower. The rain poured through the shattered glass ceiling, drenching them both in icy water. But neither moved. The air between them hummed with a volatile, static charge. David's chest heaved, his ragged breaths echoing over the sound of the storm. The dark veins crawling up his neck pulsed in a frantic, erratic rhythm, the curse violently rejecting the human connection Elisa was forcing upon it. "Step back," David ground out. The gravelly, inhuman distortion in his voice was terrifying, vibrating the puddles forming on the stone floor. His hands, gripping his knees, were trembling so violently that his knuckles were stark white. "I am right here," Elisa said softly. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. In the chaotic wreckage of the conservatory, her quiet certainty was the loudest thing in the room. She kept her eyes locked on his, refusing to let him look away, refusing to let the beast drag him back into the dark. "Focus on the rain, David. Focus on the cold. You are here. You are in control." A jagged breath tore from his throat, sounding agonizingly close to a sob. The feral, glowing gold in his eyes flared, desperate and wild, before suddenly shattering. The vibrant amber of the man returned, wide and exhausted. As soon as the human consciousness reclaimed dominance, the dark aura rippling around him vanished like blown-out smoke. The violent pressure in the room evaporated, leaving behind only the cold night air and the smell of wet earth. The black veins beneath his skin rapidly receded, sinking back into nothingness. Deprived of the curse's unnatural strength, David collapsed forward. Elisa moved on instinct. She dropped to her knees on the wet glass-strewn floor, catching his broad shoulders before he could hit the jagged stones. He was incredibly heavy, his muscles slack with total exhaustion. They slid together against the base of a heavy, overturned stone planter, the rain washing over them in a steady, freezing sheet. For a long time, the only sound was the storm. David leaned against the stone, his head tipped back, his eyes closed. His chest rose and fell in slow, shuddering gasps. Elisa remained beside him, shivering in her soaked dress, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She did not try to comfort him with touches. She sensed that his pride was already fractured enough. "You are a fool," David whispered into the dark. His voice was entirely human now, laced with a profound, bone-deep weariness. "It would have torn you apart." "It didn't," Elisa replied simply. She looked down and noticed a deep, bleeding laceration on his forearm, likely from the shattered glass of the ceiling. Without a word, she gripped the hem of her ruined silk dress and tore a long, sturdy strip from it. David opened his eyes, watching her through the gloom as she leaned closer and firmly wrapped the makeshift bandage around his arm. He flinched slightly, not from pain, but from the proximity. No one had willingly touched him in years. "Why did you leave your room, Elisa?" he asked, his amber eyes searching her face in the pale, intermittent flashes of lightning. "Your father sent you here to die so he could keep his ships sailing. You had the perfect excuse to lock the door and wait for the inevitable." Elisa tied off the bandage, pulling the knot tight. She met his gaze, her expression fiercely composed despite the shivering of her jaw. Because running away in the dark gives the monsters power. I prefer to know exactly what is trying to break me." David stared at her, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. A complex emotion flickered across his sharp features, a mixture of disbelief, respect, and a heavy, lingering sorrow. He looked away, staring at the ruined plants around them. "Go back to your room," he commanded quietly, "before the dawn breaks." Elisa did not argue. The immediate crisis had passed, and the freezing rain was beginning to numb her limbs. She stood up slowly, her bare feet careful on the glass. She looked back at him once. He remained sitting in the wreckage, a solitary, tragic figure swallowed by the shadows of his own home. When Elisa stepped out into the main corridor, she stopped dead. Standing 10 feet away, holding a silver candelabra, was Martha. The elderly woman's normally unreadable face was completely pale, her eyes wide with undisguised shock. She looked from Elisa's soaked, torn dress to the open doors of the conservatory, and then back to Elisa's face. For the first time since Elisa had arrived, Martha's perfect posture faltered. She lowered the candelabra slightly, her voice a fragile whisper. You quieted him." "He quieted himself, Martha," Elisa corrected softly, wrapping her arms around her freezing body. "He just needed a reminder that he was still there." Martha stared at her as if she were looking at a ghost. Then, slowly, the older woman gave a deep, respectful bow. Not the polite nod of a household manager, but the profound reverence of someone who had just witnessed a miracle. "Let me draw you a hot bath, Miss Elisa," Martha said, her voice steadying. "The morning will come soon." The afternoon sun did little to warm the vast, silent corridors of the Blackwood estate. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, painfully bright autumn day. But inside the manor, the shadows seemed permanently etched into the corners of the rooms. Elisa had slept until midday, her body exhausted by the adrenaline and the freezing rain. When she finally emerged from her quarters, dressed in a simple, high-necked wool dress she had unpacked herself, the house was empty. There was no sign of the destruction from the night before. The conservatory doors were locked shut, and the broken vase in the hall had been entirely cleared away. She found herself wandering toward the east wing, eventually pushing open the heavy oak doors of the grand library. It was a magnificent, multi-tiered room, smelling of old paper and leather bindings. Sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust in the quiet air. Elisa walked along the sprawling mahogany tables, running her fingers lightly over the stacks of leather-bound ledgers left scattered there. She was not looking for anything in particular, merely trying to escape the deafening silence of her own thoughts. The memory of David's feral, glowing eyes and the profound sadness that followed played on a continuous loop in her mind. She paused at the far end of a table. A thick, black ledger lay open, its pages filled with neat, handwritten columns of figures and dates. It was an accounting book. Elisa normally would have walked past it, but a familiar name caught her eye, written in sharp, dark ink at the top of the page. Holloway Shipping Syndicate. Her father's company. Frowning, Elisa pulled the heavy book closer. She scanned the columns, her heart sinking as she read the staggering numbers in the red margins. These were not minor debts. These were catastrophic, crippling losses spanning the last 5 years. Bad investments, sunken cargo, defaulted loans. "I prefer my guests not to review my private accounts," Elisa gasped, spinning around. David stood in the doorway of the library. He was dressed impeccably in a dark navy suit, his hair neatly styled, looking every inch the aristocratic billionaire the world believed him to be. There was no trace of the broken, bleeding man in the rain. The only signs of the previous night were the faint, dark circles beneath his amber eyes and the slight stiffness in his left arm where she had bandaged him. "I apologize," Elisa said, taking a step back from the table, though she kept her chin high. "I was merely walking. I saw my family's name." David walked slowly into the room, his footsteps completely silent on the thick rugs. The atmosphere in the library shifted, growing heavier, charged with the undeniable magnetism of his presence. He stopped on the opposite side of the table, looking down at the open ledger. "Your father is a very careless man with his finances, Elisa," David said, his baritone voice smooth and devoid of inflection. "He borrowed heavily from dangerous men in the city, men who do not write contracts, but collect their dues in blood and property." Elisa's brow furrowed. "He told me he owed you. He said you demanded a bride to settle a debt." David let out a harsh, humorless breath. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers tracing the edge of the ledger page. "I do not buy brides, Elisa. I am cursed, not a monster." He looked up, his turbulent amber eyes locking onto hers. 2 weeks ago, your father's creditors were preparing to seize his estate and everything in it, including you. They intended to sell you to an overseas associate to recoup their losses. Your father came to me in a panic. He offered you to me, begging me to buy his debt from them. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Elisa grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. The room spun slightly as the narrative she had accepted her entire life shattered. Her father hadn't sacrificed her to save the company from a ruthless king. He had sold her to save his own skin, throwing her at the feet of a rumored beast because it was the only way to pay off the criminal underworld. "You," Elisa's voice trembled just once, before she forced it steady. "You bought his debt. You paid them off." "I paid them," David confirmed quietly, "and I brought you here. The contract your father signed stipulates that you belong to the Blackwood estate. To the outside world, you are my sacrificial bride. To those creditors, you are untouchable. If they come for you, they must answer to me." Elisa stared at him, trying to reconcile the terrifying rumors with the man standing across from her. "Why? Why would you spend millions to save a stranger, only to lock her in a house with a curse?" David's jaw tightened. He looked away, staring out the tall windows toward the dark, forbidding tree line of the forest. "Because a cage with a locked door," he said softly, the sorrow in his voice thick and palpable, "is still better than being thrown to the wolves, even if the cage belongs to a beast." Silence fell over the library, heavy and absolute. Elisa looked at the cursed king, truly seeing him for the first time. He hadn't trapped her here to punish her. He had trapped her here to protect her. And in doing so, he had doomed himself to the torment of having a beautiful, vibrant life locked inside his lonely, dying world. Elisa slowly released her grip on the table. She walked around the heavy mahogany furniture, closing the distance between them until she stood only an arm's length away. "Then, it seems," Elisa said, her voice dropping to a gentle, resolute murmur, "we are both prisoners of my father's cowardice." David finally looked down at her. For the first time, the terrifying, unreadable mask he wore slipped, revealing a man who was desperately, overwhelmingly lonely. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended equilibrium. The revelation in the library had fundamentally shifted the gravity within the Blackwood estate. Elisa no longer felt like a prisoner waiting for the executioner. Instead, She felt like a sailor stranded on a volatile, isolated island alongside its solitary warden. David avoided her. It was not a malicious absence, but a strategic retreat. He took his meals in his study and spent his nights pacing the western wing, the heavy thud of his footsteps echoing through the floorboards. Elisa understood the evasion. In the library, he had let the mask of the terrifying Alpha King slip, revealing the honorable, exhausted man beneath. For a man who relied on a terrifying reputation to survive, that kind of vulnerability was dangerous. On the fourth morning, a thick, suffocating fog rolled off the mountains, swallowing the forest and pressing heavy, gray hands against the manor's windows. Elisa was in the small morning room, drinking black tea, when the profound silence of the estate was broken by the crunch of gravel. She stood, walking to the tall window. Through the swirling mist, a sleek, black town car idled before the main steps. It looked distinctly predatory, out of place against the Gothic antiquity of the manor. The heavy oak doors of the foyer opened, and Martha's crisp, quiet footsteps hurried past the morning room. Elisa set her teacup down, her pulse quickening. She stepped out into the hallway just as David descended the grand staircase. He moved with predatory grace, dressed in a sharp, slate-gray suit that armored him perfectly. But Elisa, who had seen him bleeding and broken in the rain, noticed the slight rigidity in his shoulders and the faint, dark shadows bruising the skin beneath his amber eyes. The curse was still drawing heavily from his reserves. "Return to your quarters, Elisa," David said, his voice a low, commanding rumble as he spotted her. He did not pause his descent. "Lock the door." "Who is it?" she asked, standing her ground in the archway. David reached the bottom of the stairs, adjusting his cuffs with meticulously steady hands. "A ghost from the city. One of the syndicate creditors your father owed. They have sent an emissary to verify their lost assets." Elisa's blood turned to ice water. The men who had intended to traffic her across the ocean were sitting in the foyer. They had come to see if the cursed king truly held the prize, or if it had all been a clerical bluff. "I am going with you," Elisa stated, her voice remarkably even. David stopped dead. He turned to her, his amber eyes narrowing with a flash of genuine anger. "This is not a parlor game. The man waiting in my drawing room is Silas Vance. He cuts throats for a living. You will go upstairs and remain unseen. If I remain unseen, he will assume you are hiding me because your claim is weak," Elisa countered, taking a step toward him. She met his intimidating glare without a single flinch. "He came to verify an asset. Let him see that the asset belongs entirely to the Blackwood estate. Let him see that I am not a hostage, but a willing bride." "You are neither," David ground out, stepping closer. The air between them instantly grew heavy, the faint scent of ozone crackling in the space between their bodies. "You are under my protection, and I protect what is mine by keeping it out of the line of fire. A shield that hides behind the wall is useless, David," she whispered fiercely. "You bought my life. Let me help you defend it." He stared down at her, the muscle in his jaw working furiously. The defiance in her eyes was a stark contrast to the terrified, weeping debtors he usually dealt with. He saw the sharp, unyielding steel in her spine, and for a fleeting second, admiration warred with his protective instincts. "If you step into that room," David warned, his voice dropping to a silken, dangerous murmur, "you must play the part. There can be no hesitation. If Vance senses weakness, he will test the boundaries of my territory. And if he does that..." David's eyes darkened to a deep, stormy brown. I will not be able to hold the beast back. I am not afraid of him, Elisa said. You should be, David replied softly. He offered his arm, his expression hardening back into the impenetrable mask of a king. Stay by my side. Do not speak unless addressed, and do not, under any circumstances, show him fear. Elisa placed her hand in the crook of his arm. Beneath the fine wool of his suit, his muscles were tense, coiled like a spring ready to snap. Together, they turned and walked toward the drawing room, stepping into the lion's den of her father's making. The drawing room was stiflingly warm, the grand fireplace roaring in a vain attempt to burn away the damp chill of the fog outside. Standing near the hearth was Silas Vance. He was a terrifyingly unremarkable man. Average height, thinning hair, dressed in a muted brown suit, he looked like an unassuming accountant, save for the dead reptilian stillness of his pale eyes. Lord Blackwood, Vance greeted, his voice possessing a reedy, nasal quality that grated against the room's elegant silence. He did not bow. He did not offer a hand. Mr. Vance, David replied smoothly, coming to a halt in the center of the room. He did not invite the man to sit. The dismissal was subtle, an assertion of absolute dominance over the territory. You have traveled a long way in terrible weather for a matter that was settled via wire transfer last week. Paperwork is a beautiful fiction, Lord Blackwood, Vance said, his pale eyes sliding slowly from David to the woman standing at his side. A slick, unpleasant smile curved his thin lips. The syndicate prefers tangible proof. Your reputation precedes you, of course. But purchasing a shipping magnate's debt in exchange for his daughter, it seemed a bit romantic for a man of your solitary nature. Vance took a slow step forward, looking Elisa up and down as if inspecting a racehorse. We simply wanted to ensure the merchandise was delivered. After all, if the girl had fled, the debt would remain unsettled. Elisa's grip on David's arm tightened imperceptibly. She kept her chin lifted, her expression arranged into a mask of cool, aristocratic indifference. She channeled the frigid composure she had been taught in finishing schools, weaponizing it. I am right here, Mr. Vance, Elisa spoke, her voice laced with a gentle, razor-sharp condescension. Though I find your use of the word merchandise terribly pedestrian. In polite society, we call it an arrangement. Vance's smile faltered, clearly not expecting the terrified hostage to possess teeth. He looked back at David. She is spirited, a difficult trait to domesticate. Are you sure you are up to the task, Lord Blackwood? There are whispers in the city, whispers that the condition that plagues your bloodline is worsening, that the king is losing his crown. The temperature in the room plummeted. The fire in the hearth seemed to instantly dim, the flames suffocated by an unnatural, invisible pressure. Elisa felt the sudden, terrifying shift in David's body. The arm beneath her hand turned to absolute stone. She glanced up at his profile. The veins along his jawline were darkening, pulsing with a faint, toxic black rhythm. The air pressure in the room grew unbearably dense, popping in Elisa's ears. He whispers, David said. His voice was no longer human. It was a dual-toned, gravelly reverberation that shook the crystal glasses on a nearby cart. The sound bypassed the ears and vibrated directly against the ribs. Vance took an involuntary step back, his pale eyes widening as the primal terror of a prey animal suddenly overrode his bravado. David released Elisa's hand and took a single, slow step toward the emissary. The shadows in the room seemed to elongate, stretching toward him like eager subjects. His amber eyes flared into a bright, unearthly gold. Let me be perfectly clear, Vance, David rumbled, the dark aura rippling visibly off his broad shoulders. The Holloway debt is mine. The woman is mine. This territory is mine. If you or your syndicate ever step foot on my property again, I will not bother calling my lawyers. I will simply tear you apart and leave the pieces in the woods. Silence, heavy and terrified, choked the room. Vance swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The arrogance had entirely drained from his unremarkable face, replaced by the pale sheen of raw survival instinct. Understood? Vance choked out, taking another step backward toward the heavy double doors. The syndicate considers the matter closed. Apologies for the intrusion. Vance turned and fled, abandoning all pretense of professional courtesy. A moment later, the heavy front door slammed shut, and the sound of tires spinning on gravel echoed through the fog. In the drawing room, the suffocating pressure lingered. David stood perfectly still, his back to Elisa, his shoulders heaving with ragged, violent breaths. The black veins were creeping higher up his neck, the beast fighting furiously for control now that it had been provoked to the surface. Elisa did not run. She stepped forward, ignoring the instinct that told her to flee the predator. She reached out, placing her hand flat against the center of his tense, vibrating back. "He is gone," Elisa said softly, her voice steady and anchoring. "The territory is secure. You are in control." David gasped, a shudder racking his massive frame as her touch grounded him. Slowly, agonizingly, the oppressive weight in the room began to lift. The gold in his eyes faded, replaced by exhausted amber, and the dark veins receded back beneath his skin. He turned around, looking down at her. He was breathless, his aristocratic composure entirely shattered. "You should not have provoked him. You put a target on your own back. I put myself exactly where I belong," Elisa replied fiercely, looking up into his tired eyes. "By your side." David stared at her, the profound isolation in his gaze beginning to crack, letting in a dangerous, agonizing sliver of hope. The aftermath of Silas Vance's departure left the Blackwood estate steeped in an eerie, fragile quiet. Dinner that evening was served in the formal dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a long, polished oak table that could easily seat 30. Tonight, it held only 2 settings, placed at adjacent corners rather than opposing ends. It was a subtle shift in the household's geography, a silent acknowledgement by Martha that the Cold War between the estate's master and his guest had fundamentally changed. David sat with a glass of dark amber liquid untouched near his right hand. He had changed out of his sharp suit into a softer, charcoal knit sweater, though the casual attire did nothing to soften the harsh, exhausted lines of his face. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened into bruised hollows, and his skin carried a pale, unhealthy pallor. Suppressing the beast in front of Vance had exacted a brutal toll on his physical body. Elisa pushed a piece of roasted duck around her porcelain plate, the heavy silver fork feeling unnaturally loud against the china. The silence between them was no longer hostile. It was heavy with unspoken questions. "You did not eat?" David observed. His voice was a low, rough murmur, stripped of its usual commanding edge. It sounded like the voice of a man who had been screaming for hours and had finally gone hoarse. "Neither did you," Elisa countered gently, looking up to meet his gaze. The feral gold was entirely gone, leaving only the turbulent, weary amber. "You are running on fumes, David. The curse, it takes a physical toll when you force it back down." David looked away, staring at the flickering candles in the center of the table. It takes a toll when it surfaces. It takes a toll when it is buried. There is no equilibrium, Elisa. There is only the slow, inevitable erosion of the shoreline until the tide eventually takes the house. Elisa set her fork down carefully. Vance said there were whispers in the city. Whispers that the condition was worsening, that the king was losing his crown. A bitter, humorless smile touched the corner of David's mouth. The city thrives on whispers. But in this case, the vultures are not wrong to circle. The curse is parasitic. For years I kept it starved by isolating myself. A beast cannot destroy what is not there. But the void... He trailed off, his jaw tightening as he searched for the words. The void eventually becomes a breeding ground. Isolation slows the beast, but it also weakens the man. It is a war of attrition I have been losing for the past 6 months. Elisa watched the faint tremor in his fingers as he finally reached for his glass. She remembered the sheer, terrifying density of the air in the drawing room, the way the dark veins had crawled up his neck like a living poison. "But you pulled it back today," she said, her voice steady and clear in the dim room. "With Vance. You were on the edge, but you didn't let it consume you. You stopped it." David took a slow sip of his drink, the crystal clinking softly against the heavy wood as he set it down. He looked at her, his expression a complex tapestry of sorrow and a terrifying, fragile awe. "I did not stop it, Elisa." "You did." Elisa blinked, caught off guard by the raw honesty in his tone. "I merely reminded you that the territory was secure." "You touched me," David corrected, his voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the entire room. "For 10 years, anyone who has seen the black vein surface has run in the opposite direction. Fear feeds the panic, and the panic feeds the beast. But you stepped forward. You anchored me." For a moment, the beast did not feel trapped in a cage. It felt guarded. He leaned forward, bracing his forearms on the table. The proximity made Elisa's breath catch, but she did not pull away. "It is incredibly dangerous, what you are doing," David warned, his eyes locking onto hers with intense, desperate focus. "By standing beside me, by proving to the Syndicate that you are mine to protect, you have tied your fate to a sinking ship. If I lose control, I will take you down with me into the dark." "I am already in the dark, David," Elisa replied, her voice unwavering. She reached across the corner of the table, her fingers gently brushing against his arm. The muscle beneath his sleeve instantly went rigid, but he did not pull away. "My father threw me into the deep water. You were the only one who offered a raft, even if it was broken. I will not apologize for helping you row." David stared at her hand, resting lightly on his arm. A shuddering breath escaped his lips, the last remnants of his formidable, aristocratic armor fracturing completely. In the flickering candlelight, the terrifying Alpha King looked breathtakingly human and devastatingly alone. "Then heaven help us both," he whispered, turning his hand over to gently, hesitantly intertwine his fingers with hers. The touch was agonizingly tender, a silent pact forged in the shadows of a doomed kingdom. Sleep refused to claim Elisa that night. The heavy velvet curtains of her bedroom were drawn tight against the pervasive autumn chill. But the cold seemed to seep through the stone walls, settling directly into her bones. She lay beneath the thick duvet, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic ticking of the grandfather clock. It was past 3 in the morning when the temperature in the room plummeted drastically. Elisa's breath plumed in a visible white cloud above her face. She sat up, pulling the covers to her chin. The fire in the hearth hadn't simply burned out. The embers had been smothered, flash frozen into brittle black stones. The oppressive, static electricity that always preceded David's loss of control crackled in the freezing air. Raising the fine hairs on her arms, she threw off the covers, her bare feet hitting the icy floorboards. She grabbed a thick wool shawl from the foot of the bed, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders as she hurried to the door. The hallway was a tunnel of absolute, biting frost. The tall windows were coated in thick, intricate ferns of ice, obscuring the moonlight. The silence was unnatural. It was not the quiet of a sleeping house, but the suffocating stillness of a held breath. Elisa followed the dropping temperature, her instincts pulling her away from the grand staircase and toward the rear of the manor. She pushed through a set of heavy doors leading to the formal gardens. The moment she stepped outside, the bitter cold stole the breath from her lungs. The expansive lawns, usually a manicured dark green, were entirely coated in a harsh, glittering layer of silver frost. The statues of ancient Greek gods looked like frozen corpses in the pale light. At the center of the garden, kneeling beside a frozen stone fountain, was David. He was shirtless, his broad back exposed to the freezing air. But he wasn't shivering. The heat rolling off his body was violently distorting the air around him, melting the frost in a perfect, steaming circle. Elisa clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle a gasp. The curse was not just crawling up his neck tonight. It was consuming him. Thick, toxic black veins mapped his entire back, pulsing with a sick, erratic rhythm. The shadows in the garden seemed to be physically pulling at him, stretching like elongated, hungry fingers across the frozen grass. He was hunched over, his hands gripping the edge of the stone basin so hard that the rock was beginning to crack under the pressure. A low, wet, agonizing sound tore from his throat, the sound of a man being torn apart from the inside out. "David!" Elisa cried out, abandoning caution and running across the frozen lawn. The ice crunched sharply beneath her bare feet, biting into her skin, but she ignored the pain. David's head snapped over his shoulder. His eyes were not just feral gold. They were a blinding, unnatural yellow, entirely devoid of human consciousness. The beast had taken the wheel. He lunged. It happened with terrifying, supernatural speed. 1 second he was at the fountain, and the next he was towering over her. Elisa stumbled backward, falling hard onto the frozen grass. David landed heavily on his hands and knees over her, his massive frame caging her against the freezing earth. He snarled, baring his teeth. His face was contorted, the aristocratic features warped by the monstrous fury of the curse. The heat radiating off him was scorching, smelling of burned ozone and copper blood. "David, stop!" Elisa pleaded, throwing her hands up, pressing her palms against his burning, heavily muscled chest. The beast roared, a deafening sound that shook the frozen leaves from the nearby trees. His massive hand grabbed her wrists, pinning them effortlessly above her head. He leaned down, his glowing yellow eyes fixing on the erratic, terrified pulse at the base of her throat. Elisa squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away. This is it, she thought, the cold earth biting into her back. The beast has won. But the fatal bite never came. Instead, a ragged, choked sob broke through the snarling. Elisa opened her eyes. David was paralyzed, hovering inches above her. The muscles in his arms were trembling so violently they looked ready to snap. He was staring at her pinned wrists, a violent war raging in his glowing eyes. "Elisa," he choked out, the word tearing through his throat like shattered glass. The human was fighting back, dragging himself up from the drowning depths by his bloody fingernails. "Run!" Please, run! He released her wrists, throwing himself backward, rolling away from her and clutching his head in agony. Elisa scrambled to her knees, her heart hammering frantically. The instinct to flee was overwhelming. He had told her to run. The beast was lethal, uncontrollable. She looked at David, writhing on the frozen grass, fighting a solitary war to protect her from himself. He was choosing to endure the agony of the curse rather than let it harm her. Elisa did not run. She crawled across the ice, ignoring the burning cold. She reached him, throwing her arms around his broad, scorching shoulders, pulling his rigid, trembling torso against her chest. She buried her face in the crook of his neck, right over the pulsing black veins. "I am not leaving you," she whispered fiercely into his skin, her voice shaking but her grip like iron. "Fight it, David. I am right here. Fight it." David let out a deafening roar of absolute agony, his arms wrapping around her waist with bone-crushing force as the curse violently rebelled against the anchor. The shadows lashed around them, a tempest of dark magic and freezing wind. Elisa held on, squeezing her eyes shut, absorbing his pain, refusing to let the cursed king weather the storm alone.